Hi, I'm Ramamurthy Mahesh from Infor Development. In this presentation, we'll look at the credit and rebill enhancement in invoicing. Agenda for today's presentation, we'll first look at the need for the credit and rebill enhancement. Then we'll look at the solution overview and the solution detail. We'll look at the master data setup needed, the conditions which should be satisfied before credit and rebill can be done, the process of crediting and rebilling, and the limitations. Finally, we'll have a demo on this topic. The need for credit and rebill. There are many situations when an invoice which is already printed or even posted need to be reverted back. Examples are given on the screen. There could be many other scenarios why this would be needed. For example, when the text on the invoice is not correct, or the customer calls up and points out an error in the invoice, maybe a tax ID of the customer is wrong. In some cases, the invoice was printed but never really came out of the printer. At present, there is no standard way to handle this kind of situation. What was required was an easy way to handle this kind of exceptional situation when a created invoice need to be reverted back and the invoicing process should start all over again. Let's look at the overview of this solution. The credit and rebill process provides a standard way to handle rebilling process based on authorization set up for the user. When an invoice which has been posted is selected for credit and rebill, what happens is the selected invoice is cancelled, credit note is created and linked automatically to the original invoice, and billable lines are created based on the invoice which is cancelled. These billable lines can be further invoiced by the user. Let's look at the master data needed for this credit and rebill process. When an invoice is selected and for credit and rebill, a credit note is created. This replacement credit note has a special transaction type which has to be maintained in the invoicing parameter by source type. In addition to this, users can be authorized to initiate the credit and rebill process, and this is controlled by the authorizations box in the user profile. When the checkbox allow change of invoicing data is enabled, then the users can credit and rebill invoices. There are some conditions before credit and rebill process can start. First, the invoice should be posted. If the invoice is in the status of composed or printed, then these invoices cannot be initiated for credit and rebill. The source document, for example a sales order, should allow change. If the sales order is already process delivered is done, and sales order is closed or removed, then it is no longer possible to do a credit and rebill. Financial periods of the original invoice should still be open. This is because the credit note created to close the original invoice goes to the same period. The original invoice should be fully open in finance. If there has been any payment or credit note linked to this invoice, then credit and rebill is no longer allowed on this invoice. There are restrictions on some types of invoices, and we can look at the full list of these restrictions in the later slide. An invoice which is already replaced earlier or which is a result of a replacement process can no longer be credited and rebilled. Of course, finally, users should be authorized for taking out or carrying out this process. Let's look at the credit and rebill process. In the invoices session, when an invoice is selected, the credit and rebill specific option or button is available. When this option is chosen, the selected invoice status is set to cancelled. A replacement credit note is created to financially close this selected invoice. The replacement credit note uses the replacement credit note transaction type and series defined in the parameters. A reference is created between the replacement credit note and the selected invoice. The replacement credit note is linked to the original invoice in finance, resulting in the balance of both the original invoice and the replacement credit note being zero. The integration transactions of the original invoice are reversed. So in fact, the revenue and COGS transactions are reversed. In addition to that, billable lines are created based on the original invoice lines. The created billable lines have status on hold, allowing the user to change data if needed. Billable lines data can be changed based on user authorization setup in the user profile. And when these changes are carried out, then the invoicing process can start again for this billable line. When these kind of billable lines are invoiced again, a reference is created with the original invoice which was cancelled, as well as the source packages like sales order, contract are updated with the new invoice number. Let's look at some limitations of this credit and rebate process. Credit and rebate is not enabled for the following types of invoices. In case of credit notes, internal invoices, if invoices originating from based on another invoice, for example, an interest invoice or a debit credit note, self-bill invoices are not included, intercompany settlement invoices, advance payment requests, tax only invoices are not included. When a credit and rebate is attempted on this kind of invoices, then the user is informed that the credit and rebate is not possible for this kind of invoices. So let's look at the demo. Now let's look at the demo for credit and rebate. First, let's look at the master data setup needed for credit and rebate. Let's go to the invoicing parameters. In the invoicing parameters, we can set up the transaction type to be used during the credit and rebate process. You can see here for replacement credit note, you can set up special transaction type and series for the credit note transaction type. This transaction type and series will be used when an invoice is being credited and rebilled. The next setup involved is to authorize a user for credit and rebate process. In the user profile, a number of attributes can be set up which will be used during invoicing. And here there is authorization checkbox, allow changes to invoicing data. When this checkbox is enabled, users will be allowed to credit and rebill a posted invoice. Let's now look at the credit and rebill process. We have an invoice here which we want to credit and rebill. Let's look at the invoice lines. There are two sales order lines for this invoice. And if you go to the tax details, we see a tax rate of 10% with a tax code of net 10. Let's assume we need to change this tax code. So we select the invoice and credit and rebill. We see a posted batch created report and a second invoice created for the sales order. Selected invoice is cancelled, and there is a new invoice with the replacement credit note transaction type, negative amounts, is status posted. Let's look at the related invoice for this credit note. And here we see the reference back to the original invoice. And if you go to the open entry, let's look at all the open entries and select the credit note which we just created. We see the negative amounts here and the balance is 0. That's because the created credit note is directly assigned to the original invoice when we do a credit and rebill. Let's look at now the original invoice. and the balance of the original invoice is 0 as well. If we go to the linked documents for this invoice, we can see the credit note which was created with the credit and rebill process. So in fact, the original invoice is financially closed in open entries. Let's look at the integration transaction. We see here a number of revenue and cost of goods sold transaction. The revenue transaction are reversed, and the cost of goods sold transactions are reversed as well. Let's go to the billable line with which we can start the rebill process. You can see the status is on hold, and so we can change the tax code. Let's change it to net 12, which gives a 12% tax. Let's confirm the billable line. And create invoice. You can see the invoice here, the new invoice number, and the new tax rate of 12%. And the invoicing 360, we see 3 invoices now. A new invoice with the changed amounts, changed tax amount. If we now look at the sales order invoice lines, we can see the new invoice number linked to the sales order invoice lines with the status replaced. This concludes the demo about credit and rebill in invoicing.